Tug Hill Plateau, New York, October 1893. The air, smelling of damp earth and decaying maple leaves, carried the first premonition of winter. On the scarred landscape of the recently shuttered Carthage Iron Company, a man was doing something no one could understand. He was cleaning out a furnace. Not for salvage, not for scrap, but with the focused care of a man preparing a home. The structure was a cold blast stack, a 30-foot stone pyramid left to the mercy of the seasons. Its sandstone blocks were stained with rust and time, its iron fittings plundered. To the handful of families lingering in the company town, it was a monument to a dead industry. To Ondrej Hraško, it was a promise. Truman Esterbrook, the former charcoal iron foreman, stopped his wagon, his face a mask of professional disbelief. He'd supervised the building and running of a dozen stacks like this one. He knew their guts, their flaws, their soul. "Hraško," he called out, his voice sharp with authority. "What in God's name are you doing? That's not a house. It's a tomb." Ondrej, a compact man with shoulders shaped by a lifetime of heavy work, looked down from the charging hole. He didn't shout back. His voice, when it came, was quiet, barely cutting through the autumn wind. "It will be warm," Esterbrook scoffed, turning to Silas Croft, who was leaning on a fence post nearby. "Warm with damp and lung fever? The man is mad. He'll put his family in the ground before the thaw." Croft nodded slowly, chewing on a piece of straw. "It's a foolish business. Stone sweats. Everyone knows that." Another man, Ben Patcher, who had lost his job with the furnace closure, just shook his head. "The Slovak is chasing ghosts, trying to live inside the work that left us all behind." The mockery was constant, a low hum of certainty for men who knew the brutal realities of a Tug Hill winter. They knew clapboard and timber, horsehair plaster and wool blankets. They knew the ceaseless, losing battle against the cold. The idea of living inside a derelict industrial stack wasn't just eccentric. It was a form of madness, a direct challenge to the hard-won wisdom of the frontier. What did this Slovak furnace tender, this Vysoka Pek hutnik, understand about the physics of thermal mass that a seasoned iron foreman and a community of hardened New York settlers had missed? What secret was he reading in the cold stones of a dead furnace that they saw only as a ruin? The answer to that question would not only save his family, but would also rewrite the rules of survival on one of the harshest landscapes in America. But first, there would be the work, the mockery, and the coming of the snow. If you've ever felt the biting cold seep through the walls of your own home and wondered if there was a better way, a more fundamental way, to think about shelter, then stay with me. I promise you will learn a principle of thermal science so powerful and so simple, it was perfected centuries before modern insulation was ever invented. Be sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments. What's the strangest, most unconventional home you've ever seen or heard of? Ondrej Hraško was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor a frontiersman trained in the arts of the American log cabin. He was a man of the Vysoka Pek, the high furnace. His world, back in the Spiš region of Slovakia, had revolved around the rhythmic life and death of fire. He knew the specific heft of a charcoal basket, the smell of limestone flux, the deep, resonant groan of a furnace settling as it cooled. His hands understood the language of fire brick, the subtle texture of sandstone that held heat, and the glassy, brittle nature of slag that did not. He had spent 2 decades reading the state of a furnace, not by gauges, but by the color of the flame at the tuyere, the low hum of the blast, and the feel of the heat radiating from the stack's stone jacket long after the fires were banked. He had brought his wife Zuzana and their 2 small children, Jan and Katerina, to America for the promise of a foreman's wage at the Carthage Iron Company. They arrived in the autumn of 1892 and were given a standard company house, a hastily built clapboard box that was little more than a wooden tent. Their first winter on the Tug Hill Plateau was a lesson in suffering. It was a cold that was not a force, but a presence. It lived inside the walls. Ondrej remembered the shocking pain of touching the bare iron door latch in the morning, a searing brand that burned his fingerprints away. He watched Zuzana struggle with sourdough starter that chilled and died, producing loaf after loaf of sour, dense brick that was barely edible. The cold was an anti-life force, arresting the very processes of fermentation and warmth. The most haunting memory was of sitting at their small table, writing a letter to his brother back home. He dipped the pen in the inkwell, wrote 3 words, and on the 4th, the nib scratched dry. The ink in the well had frozen solid in the middle of his sentence. That winter, the Hraško family was never truly warm. They burned through their allotment of wood by February and spent the rest of the winter burning scavenged timber, green and smoky. They lived in a perpetual twilight, huddled around a stove that consumed fuel with monstrous appetite, but gave back only a small circle of heat. A few feet away, the air was glacial. Condensation from their breath froze in crystalline ferns on the inside of the walls. They slept in their coats, under every blanket they owned, and still woke up shivering, their joints aching with a deep, penetrating chill. Ondrej saw the exhaustion in Zuzana's eyes, the perpetual cough that settled in his children's chests. He was a master of heat, a man whose entire trade was the management of thousands of degrees, and he could not keep his own family from freezing. The problem wasn't the stove, and it wasn't a lack of wood. The problem was the house itself. The conventional frontier cabin was a thermal sieve. Its failure was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of heat. The thin, uninsulated walls of a typical clapboard or even log structure had almost no capacity to store thermal energy. They were a flimsy barrier, not a repository. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. The standard cabin was a victim of all 3. The cold conducted directly through the wood and plaster. The wind, a constant feature of the plateau, drove cold air into the house through 100 tiny gaps, creating relentless convective loops. Warm air from the stove would rise to the ceiling, transfer its energy to the cold roof, and fall back down as a chilling draft. Families like the Crofts and the Patchers were living inside a machine designed for maximum heat loss. They fought back by burning more wood. An iron stove, roaring hot, would pour out radiant heat, making the spot right next to it tolerable. But this radiant energy would strike the cold walls and immediately be lost to the outside. The walls themselves never warmed up. They were a constant, cold presence, perpetually leaching warmth from the air and from the bodies of the people inside. To stay warm, you had to generate heat faster than the house could shed it. It was an exhausting, expensive, and ultimately losing battle. That winter, Truman Esterbrook recorded in his company log that the average family burned through 8 cords of hardwood. The sound of axes ringing in the frozen woods was the soundtrack of survival, and the sight of smoke pouring from a chimney was no sign of comfort. It was a sign of desperate, inefficient burning. Ondrej Hraško, having survived that first winter, knew he would not endure a second. When the iron company failed in the summer of 1893 and most of the workers packed up and left, Ondrej saw not disaster, but opportunity. While others saw a field of industrial skeletons, he saw a grove of stone trees, each with a heart designed to hold fire. He walked the line of abandoned furnaces, tapping the sandstone blocks with a small hammer, listening to the sound they made. He was listening for integrity, for the deep, solid ring of stone, without major cracks. He found his furnace number 4, listing slightly but with its fire brick lining largely intact. His work began in September. First, he had to clean it. Decades of iron production had left a thick crust of slag, soot, and solidified iron deposits, a salamander, at the base. For 2 weeks, with a heavy sledge and a crowbar, he chipped and scraped, clearing the interior down to the fire brick hearth. Zuzana and the children hauled the debris out in baskets. The neighbors watched the growing pile of black, glassy refuse and shook their heads. Once it was clean, Ondrej began the construction of his home inside the stone shell. He was not going to live against the cold outer walls. He framed a small 2-room cabin, roughly 14 by 20 feet, in the widest part of the stack space. Crucially, he left a gap of nearly 2 feet between his new wooden walls and the inner fire brick wall of the furnace. This was not a space for insulation in the modern sense. It was a space for air, a buffer zone that would be warmed by the structure itself. Truman Estabrook paid him a visit during this phase. The foreman, though unemployed, still carried an air of command. He walked inside the furnace, his boots crunching on stone chips. He ran a hand over the mottled fire brick. "Hraško, I've seen a dozen of these stacks torn down. They're riddled with cracks you can't see. Water gets in. The slag pockets are like sponges for damp." He pointed a thick finger at the base where Ondrej was laying a simple wooden floor. "Come the January thaw, you'll have meltwater seeping in from the top and frost heaving from the bottom. This place will be a dripping, rotten mess by Candlemas. You're building a coffin for your family." It was a professional opinion, delivered without malice. Estabrook's experience told him that stone structures on the Tug Hill were prone to moisture. It was a legitimate, damning critique. Ondrej paused his work, looking at the foreman. He didn't argue about water or rot. He simply said, "The stone must be warm first. Then it will be dry." Estabrook just shook his head and left. He had warned the man. The final, most ingenious piece of the design was the hearth. The furnace already had openings at the base for the tuyères, the pipes that blasted air into the hot core. Ondrej chose the largest of these arched openings. He sealed the others with stone and clay, and in this one, Beetelsprut Bikson Jensen, he built his hearth and chimney for a small cast iron stove. The stovepipe didn't vent directly outside. Instead, it snaked up 20 feet inside the main furnace stack before exiting. This meant that nearly all the waste heat from the chimney would be captured by the towering column of stone and brick above it. He wasn't just heating his small cabin. He was slowly, deliberately charging the entire furnace structure with warmth. The principle Ondrej Hraško was exploiting is known as thermal mass, and more specifically, thermal mass lag. It is one of the most elegant and powerful concepts in thermodynamics, and it is the absolute opposite of the logic governing the clapboard cabins. A material with high thermal mass, like stone, brick, or concrete, can absorb and store a tremendous amount of heat energy. Think of it like a battery, but for heat instead of electricity. A standard, low-mass wall, like wood, can't store much heat. When you turn off the stove in a cabin, the heat dissipates in minutes. The walls have no thermal energy to give back. Ondrej's home had a 4-foot-thick wall of dense sandstone and fire brick. This wall had a colossal thermal mass. When Ondrej lit his small, efficient stove, he was doing 2 things. He was heating the air in his small interior cabin for immediate comfort, but more importantly, he was sending a steady stream of heat, measured in British thermal units, or BTUs, into the millions of pounds of stone surrounding him. The process is slow. The stone absorbs the heat gradually, molecule by molecule. It might take days of continuous, low-level heating to fully charge the stone battery. But once charged, the magic happens. The release of that stored heat is also incredibly slow. This is the lag. Imagine the temperature outside plummets from 20 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. In a wooden cabin, the inside temperature follows almost immediately. The occupants feel the drop within the hour. But in Ondrej's furnace home, the outer surface of the 4-foot wall gets colder, but it takes many, many hours for that cold front to penetrate through the stone. All the while, the inner surface of the wall, warmed by days of stored heat, continues to radiate gentle, steady warmth into the living space. The furnace acted as a massive thermal flywheel. It smoothed out the brutal temperature swings of the outside world. It didn't just block the cold. It absorbed the memory of the fire. The 2-foot air gap Ondrej had left was critical. The inner stone wall would radiate its heat into this airspace, which would then gently warm the wooden walls of his actual cabin. He wasn't living in a stone tomb. He was living in a wooden house, nestled inside a massive, low-temperature radiator. Esterbrook's fear of dampness was also unfounded because of this principle. A cold stone wall will condense moisture from warm, humid air, just like a glass of ice water. But a stone wall that is consistently warmer than the air around it will never be damp. It will, in fact, actively work to keep the space dry. Ondrej's simple statement, "The stone must be warm first," was a precise summary of a profound thermodynamic truth. The snows began in early November, soft and silent at first, then thickening into a relentless daily barrage. By mid-December, the Tug Hill Plateau was buried. The landscape vanished, replaced by a rolling desert of white, sculpted by the wind. The official measurement at Lowville would eventually record 19 feet of total snowfall that winter. For 6 straight months, the ground would not be seen again. Then, the cold arrived. Not the crisp, clean cold of a sunny winter day, but a deep, still, penetrating cold that settled over the plateau for weeks on end. The mercury in the official thermometers contracted into a tight bulb, holding steady at 20, sometimes 22 degrees below zero. In this kind of cold, the world becomes brittle. Trees cracked with reports like rifle shots. Metal became fragile. The very air seemed to have weight. For the families in the remaining company houses, life contracted to a small, grim circle around the stove. The battle Ondrej had fought the year before was now their own. Silas Croft's family burned through their woodpile at an alarming rate. His wife stuffed rags into the window frames, but still, the drafts cut like knives. Their children, like the Hraško children the year before, developed hacking coughs that echoed in the cold, still air. At the Patcher house, the well pump froze solid. For 2 weeks, Ben Patcher had to melt snow on the stove for every drop of water for drinking, cooking, and washing. The effort was immense, the reward meager. Inside furnace number 4, life was different. In the mornings, Ondrej would rise and add a few small logs to the stove. The fire never went out completely, but was banked to coals overnight. The air in their small cabin was cool, but not cold. It was the air of a cellar in autumn, still and calm. There were no drafts. The ceaseless howl of the wind over the plateau was a distant, muffled whisper, a sound from another world. By mid-morning, with the stove giving off a steady, moderate heat, the cabin was truly warm. This was where the miracle of thermal mass revealed itself in the small details of domestic life. Zuzana discovered she could place her dough bowl on the floor near the inner wall, and the bread would rise, light and airy. The gentle, persistent warmth from the stone was perfect for the yeast. She baked twice a week, and the smell of fresh bread, a scent of impossible normalcy, filled their home. The children, Jan and Katarina, could play on the floor in their shirt sleeves, their fingers nimble enough to draw on their slates. The ink in Ondrej's inkwell remained a deep, liquid black. One day Zuzana looked at her husband, a small, wondrous smile on her face. "Ondrej," she said, her voice soft, "I can sew." My fingers do not ache." It was a simple observation, but it was everything. The cold had been a constant thief, stealing dexterity, comfort, and peace. Here, inside the stone, they were whole again. They burned less than a third of the wood the other families did, using a small, steady fire instead of a roaring, desperate one. The stone did the rest of the work. In late January, the weight of the snow became a structural threat. Truman Estabrook, hired by the Iron Company's receivers to assess the condition of the remaining assets, was tasked with surveying the property. His job was grim. Count the number of furnace stacks whose charging roofs had collapsed under the immense snow load. It was a dangerous task, done on snowshoes in the biting cold. One evening, as the winter sun bled out behind the western hills, leaving the snowscape in a deep blue twilight, Estabrook was making his way back. He stopped on a ridge, counting the dark shapes of the furnaces against the snow. Number 1, roof gone. Number 2, collapsed. Number 3, a jagged ruin. Then his eyes fell on number 4. The roof was holding, but that wasn't what caught his attention. From its peak, a thin, almost invisible thread of white smoke rose straight into the still, frigid air. The smoke itself was not unusual. What was astonishing was the ground around the furnace's base. Every other structure, every tree, every fence post was choked with 6-foot drifts. The entire world was a study in white and blue. But around the base of Ondrej Hraško's furnace, there was a perfect dark circle. The snow had melted. Bare ground, black and damp, was visible in a ring 5 feet wide around the entire stone pyramid. The furnace was leaking warmth, not in a wasteful plume of smoke, but through its very foundations. The stone was so thoroughly saturated with heat that it was warming the frozen earth around it. Estabrook stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones, staring at that impossible circle of bare ground. It was a flag of defiance planted in the heart of winter. It was the quietest, most powerful refutation of his own expert opinion he had ever witnessed. It was not an argument. It was a fact, written on the landscape itself. A few days later, his curiosity overcoming his pride, Estabrook made his way to furnace number 4. He knocked on the heavy wooden door Ondrej had fashioned. The Slovak opened it. Estabrook braced himself for a wave of damp, chilly, stagnant air, the kind he knew from cellars and abandoned mines. Instead, he was met with a gentle, silent wave of simple warmth. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a calm, pervasive comfort. The air smelled of baked bread and wood smoke. He stepped inside. He saw the small, tidy cabin, the 2 children playing quietly on the floor. He saw Zuzana at a table, mending a shirt. He saw the small stove, burning with a low, steady flame. His foreman's eyes scanned for the signs he expected: water stains, frost on the walls, a puddle of melt on the floor. There were none. The place was perfectly, impossibly dry. Ondrej said nothing, simply gesturing for him to enter. Estabrook, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew, walked over to the inner wall of the furnace, the fire brick that separated the wooden cabin from the stone mass. He expected it to feel, at best, neutral. At worst, it would be cold, leaching heat from his body. He tentatively placed his bare palm against it. The brick was warm, not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm, like a stone that has been lying in the sun all afternoon. It was radiating a gentle, steady heat. He looked around and saw a small copper pot of stew sitting on the floor, leaning against that same wall. It was nearly noon. A faint wisp of steam was still rising from it. "The fire has been banked since breakfast," Ondrej said quietly, seeing where the foreman was looking. The pot of stew, still warm hours after the main heat source was reduced, was the final, irrefutable proof. It was a domestic demonstration of a massive physical principle. The wall itself was the hearth. The entire furnace was a slow, colossal engine of warmth. Estabrook slowly pulled his hand back from the wall. He looked at Ondrej Hraško, and the certainty and professional pride had drained from his face, replaced by a deep, quiet awe. He finally understood. Hraško hadn't just built a shelter to keep the cold out. He had enlisted the stone itself as an ally, turning the very mass of the furnace into a reservoir of heat. "You didn't build a house, Hraško," Estabrook said, his voice raspy with respect. "You built a season. You built a mild autumn that lasts until spring." That winter, Truman Estabrook became Ondrej Hraško's advocate. He told everyone who would listen. He brought Ben Patcher and Silas Croft to see the furnace. They too felt the warm wall, saw the steaming pot, and left shaking their heads in wonder. There was no gloating from Ondrej. When they asked him how, he explained it simply. "The stone remembers the fire," he would say. He shared his knowledge freely, explaining how to choose a sound stack, how to build the inner room, how to vent the stove. He spoke of heat not as a fleeting comfort to be constantly generated, but as something to be stored, to be banked, to be saved. The idea, radical as it was, began to spread. The following year, an itinerant journeyman from Pennsylvania, part of a crew tasked with dismantling some of the more ruined industrial sites, boarded with the Hraško family for a month in the autumn of 1894. He was a practical man, a carpenter by trade, and he watched Ondrej's preparations for the coming winter with a keen, analytical eye. He saw the logic instantly. It was not a fluke. It was a system. He sketched the design in a notebook, the inner cabin, the air gap, the chimney venting into the main stack. He took that notebook with him to his next job in the Adirondacks, where another set of old charcoal furnaces stood abandoned. By 1896, his letters to Ondrej confirmed that 3 families near the McIntyre Iron Works were living in furnace homes, following the Hraško pattern. The idea had taken root, a piece of old-world knowledge transplanted to the harsh soil of the American frontier, spreading quietly from one abandoned stack to another. It never became a widespread movement, but for a handful of families in the coldest corners of the North Country, it was the difference between survival and misery. The genius of Ondrej Hraško's furnace home was not that it was a new technology. In fact, it was ancient. What he did on the Tug Hill Plateau was a direct application of the same principle used in Roman hypocausts, Korean ondol floors, and the massive masonry heaters of his European homeland. He recognized that the frontier's obsession with lightweight, fast-to-build wooden structures was a fatal flaw in a climate defined by relentless cold. He saw the solution hiding in plain sight, in the ruins of the very industry that had drawn him there. Today, the most advanced concepts in sustainable building and passive solar design are returning to this fundamental idea. Architects and engineers speak of trombe walls, concrete slabs, and phase-change materials, all modern methods of incorporating thermal mass into a home to store the sun's energy by day and release it slowly through the night. They are rediscovering what Ondrej Hraško knew intuitively. A home shouldn't just be a barrier against the elements. It should be a partner in managing them. There is a profound lesson in the stone walls of furnace number 4. In a culture that worships the new, the fast, and the disposable, Ondrej Hraško looked at an object others saw as obsolete and useless, and saw its true, enduring strength. He didn't build something new to fight the cold. He listened to what an old stone giant built to contain industrial fire still remembered about holding on to warmth. He understood that true resilience often comes not from invention, but from recognition, the wisdom to see the hidden potential in the things we have already built, and the humility to learn from the deep, slow memory of the earth itself. Thank you for joining us for this story of ingenuity and survival. If you found this exploration of thermal mass and frontier innovation valuable, please like this video and subscribe for more stories from the annals of practical genius. And let us know in the comments. What piece of obsolete technology do you think still holds valuable lessons for us today? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, while the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building techniques today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.